They laughed at the obese widow until a mountain man said, "She's mine now." The chill of late autumn clung to the town square of Cedar Rock. A crowd had gathered, boots stomping the frozen ground, voices rising with cruel anticipation. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Vance, a widow whose figure was broad and heavy-set, her dark dress straining against her frame. The sheriff's gavel struck the auction block, and the laughter that followed cut sharper than any blade. "Her land, her stock, her tools, everything's forfeit," Sheriff Dugan barked. "Debt unpaid is debt dishonored. Step right up, gentlemen. Who'll take the Vance farm?" Eleanor's cheeks burned as whispers darted through the crowd. Too big for her britches. No man would want her, not after losing one already. Each word sank like a stone. She clutched her shawl tighter, heart pounding as she watched Thaddeus Blackwood, a councilman with slick hair and sharper eyes, smirk from the front row. This was his plan all along, to strip her of dignity, seize her land, and see her broken. The bidding began. Coins clinked, men jeered, and Eleanor's breath came shallow. Everything her husband had built, everything she had tended since his death, was being sold like scrap. Then a heavy thud silenced the noise. A pouch of silver landed hard on the table, scattering coins across the wood. The crowd turned as a massive figure stepped forward. Jedediah Kane, Jed to the few who knew him, towered above the townsfolk, his shoulders broad, his beard thick, his eyes like storm clouds. A man of the mountains, seen rarely in town and spoken of mostly in whispers. "She's mine now," Jed said, his voice rough as gravel. The square fell silent. Eleanor's lips parted in shock, and for the first time that day, the laughter died. The silence that followed Jed Kane's words was heavier than the autumn clouds pressing low over Cedar Rock. Men, who had been laughing only moments before, shifted uncomfortably, their smirks faltering. Women drew their shawls closer, whispering behind gloved hands. Eleanor stood rooted, her shawl clutched to her chest, hardly believing what she had heard. "She's mine now." The words echoed in her ears. She had expected humiliation, ruin, perhaps even to collapse right there on the auction block. But instead, a mountain man, a stranger, had thrown down silver and claimed her, not as land or property, but as if he meant to shield her from the cruelty of the crowd. Jedediah Kane was not a man Cedar Rock welcomed. He came down from the high country only a handful of times a year to trade furs for salt, coffee, or powder. His figure was always unmistakable, tall as a pine, broad as a grizzly, his beard thick, his hair touched with early gray despite its youth. His face bore the marks of mountain life, weathered skin, a scar along his jaw, eyes like dark ice that rarely betrayed thought. Some whispered he had once worked as a logger until an accident took the life of his brother. Others swore he was a trapper who'd killed a bear with his bare hands. Whatever the truth, few dared to stand in his path. And now he stood squarely between Eleanor and the ruin that had been arranged for her. Thaddeus Blackwood's smug grin curdled into a scowl. He had expected to walk away from the auction with Eleanor's farm deed in hand. "This isn't your concern, Kane," Blackwood said, voice tight with fury. "The widow can't pay her debts. The council's ruling is final." Jed's gaze cut to him, steady as stone. "Her husband made me a promise years ago," he said gruffly. "If misfortune ever took him, I was to see she didn't fall to wolves. I aim to keep that promise." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Few had known of such an arrangement. Eleanor's chest tightened, tears threatening to rise. She remembered her husband's friendship with a tall logger who had visited their farm a handful of times, long ago. She had not known that man was Jed Kane, nor that he had carried a promise across the years. Sheriff Dugan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "The debts are still owed, Jed. Money must be paid." Jed's hand landed heavy on the pouch of silver. "That'll do for now. More when it's needed." The sheriff, seeing no better path, nodded reluctantly. Blackwood's jaw worked in silent rage, but even he would not challenge Kane in front of the whole town. Eleanor, cheeks burning, could hardly lift her eyes. Shame still clung to her, her size, her widowhood, her helplessness before the town. Yet, as Jed draped his rough buffalo coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the bitter wind, something shifted. The weight of humiliation lightened, if only a fraction. The crowd slowly dispersed, robbed of their sport. Blackwood stormed away, muttering threats, and Eleanor, trembling beneath the warmth of the coat, realized that her life had changed in the span of a heartbeat. She did not yet understand why Jed Kane had chosen to intervene, but as the mountain loomed on the horizon, she knew one thing: her path was no longer hers alone to walk. The wagon wheels rattled over frozen ruts as Cedar Rock shrank behind them. Eleanor sat stiffly on the bench, Jed Kane beside her, the heavy buffalo coat wrapped around her shoulders. Her heart still thundered from the humiliation of the auction, from the shocking weight of his words. "She's mine now." Neither of them spoke for a long while. The only sounds were the creak of harness leather, the mule's steady snort, and the crunch of wheels over frost. Eleanor dared a glance at him from the corner of her eye. He looked straight ahead, his jaw tight, his scar catching the last red gleam of sunset. His silence wasn't cruel. It was the silence of a man who had grown used to being alone. At last, her voice broke into the cold air. "Why did you do it? Why spend your coin on me?" Jed didn't look at her. "Because your husband asked it of me years back. He said if misfortune came, I was to see you weren't left to carrion." Her throat tightened. "But you didn't have to. Not like that. Not in front of them all." Jed flicked the reins, his voice steady. "They'd have torn you apart with laughter if no one stood. Better to give them silence than shame." The words struck deep. Eleanor swallowed hard and pulled the coat tighter. For years she had carried the weight of widowhood, of whispers about her size, her solitude. But here was a man who, without flourish or pity, had chosen to stand. They rode until the last light bled from the sky, then made camp near a stand of pines. Jed built a fire quickly, his hands practiced, his movements spare. He handed her a tin cup of water, then tore a slab of bread in half. "Eat," he said simply. She accepted, with trembling hands. The bread was coarse but filling, the water cold and pure. Watching him across the fire, she found herself wondering what kind of man lived in silence high in the mountains. What grief or choice had driven him there? The night pressed close, coyotes howling in the distance. Eleanor lay wrapped in the buffalo coat near the fire, her heart still raw from the day. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard Blackwood's mocking tone, saw the sneers of townsfolk. Yet every time she woke, Jed was there, sitting upright, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the flames. A sentinel carved from stone. By dawn, frost coated the grass and their breath steamed in the air. Jed saddled the mule and helped her into the wagon with one strong hand. His touch was brief, steady, and strangely respectful. The trail climbed higher that day, winding through canyons and across streams crusted with ice. Eleanor's body ached with every jolt, but Jed slowed the mule whenever the road grew rough. He said little, but when he did, his words were meant to teach. "See that patch of birch?" he said once, pointing toward pale trunks. "Bark peels easy, good for fire in wet weather." Another time, he crouched beside a cluster of red berries. "Don't eat these. Birds can, but they'll poison you." His lessons were simple, practical, offered without judgment. Slowly, Eleanor realized he wasn't just guiding her to his home, he was showing her how to survive in it. As evening fell, clouds rolled low, heavy with snow. They pressed on until smoke rose faintly from a chimney tucked against the slope. Eleanor's breath caught at the sight. The cabin stood sturdy, logs squared and roof weighted with stone. It was no grand house, but it radiated something she had not felt in months. Permanence. Jed halted the mule, his voice quiet. "We're here." Eleanor sat frozen on the wagon bench, staring at the cabin. Her old life, the jeers, the debt, the ruin, was far behind her now. Ahead lay a world she did not know, in the care of a man she barely understood. Fear knotted her stomach, yet beneath it pulsed something she had not felt since her husband's death. A fragile, flickering hope. The cabin door creaked as Jed pushed it open, stepping aside so Eleanor could enter first. Warmth washed over her, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke, leather, and herbs hung to dry. A wide stone hearth glowed with embers. A rough-hewn table sat beneath the window, its surface scarred by years of use. Shelves lined one wall, filled with jars of beans, flour, and dried fruit. Against the far corner stood a sturdy bed, neatly made, and a ladder that led up to a loft. Eleanor clutched her shawl, unsure of her place. She had braced herself for squalor or worse, but the cabin was orderly, tended, and unmistakably lived in. Jed set down the bundles he carried and gestured toward the loft. "You'll sleep up there. It's warmer, private." Her throat tightened. After the jeers in town, the humiliation of being treated like property, she had expected to be cast aside in some dark corner. Instead, here was space set apart for her. It was more mercy than she'd known in months. The first days passed in awkward silence. Jed kept to his work, splitting logs, checking snares, hauling water from the spring. Eleanor tried to make herself useful, though her hands trembled when she kneaded dough or stoked the fire. She burned the first batch of bread, bracing for mockery. Instead, Jed scraped away the charred crust and said only, "Next time, add less wood." He left her to learn, and slowly she did. She swept the floor, milked the goats under Jed's watchful eye, and mended torn shirts by firelight. Each task reminded her she was not useless, no matter what the town had said. At night, when the wind howled around the eaves, she hummed old hymns from her Amish childhood. At first, her voice wavered, but in the quiet of the cabin, the notes steadied, filling the room with something alive. Jed never interrupted. One evening, as snow tapped against the shutters, Eleanor dared to ask, "Why live up here alone?" Jed sat sharpening his knife, his scar catching the firelight. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, voice low, "Because men like Blackwood take what they want. The mountains take too, but they don't lie about it." She understood more in what he didn't say, the grief in his eyes, the solitude carved into his voice. He was a man shaped by loss, same as her. The days grew colder, and so did the work. Jed showed her how to split kindling without blistering her palms, how to line the chicken coop with straw to keep the birds alive. He even carved a stool wide and sturdy so she could sit comfortably at the table. When she traced the smooth wood with her fingers, she felt tears sting her eyes. The nights brought a different kind of closeness. Jed read from a worn Bible, his deep voice slow, halting, but reverent. Eleanor listened, her hands busy with needle and thread. Once, a goat broke loose during a storm and staggered into the cabin dripping wet. Laughing despite herself, she wrapped it in a quilt. Jed actually chuckled, a rusty, unused sound that warmed the room more than the fire. Bit by bit, the silence between them softened. Eleanor's shame began to lift. Her body, mocked as clumsy and too large, proved strong in the mountains. She carried wood, hauled water, and stood unbowed against the cold. With each passing day, she saw herself less as the widow humiliated in Cedar Rock, and more as a woman who could endure, even belong. One night, lying in the loft beneath heavy quilts, she whispered into the dark, "Maybe I wasn't meant to be broken. Maybe I was meant for here." Below, Jed sat in his chair by the fire, the lamplight catching his scarred face. He said nothing, but his eyes softened, and for the first time since she had met him, his silence felt less like distance and more like an answer. Winter dug its claws into the valley. Snow lay heavy on the roof, and the creek froze solid except where it rushed fast over stone. Eleanor had grown stronger in the cold months, her arms firm from splitting kindling, her steps steady across the icy yard. She no longer flinched at her reflection in the frosted window. She was not the jeered-at widow of Cedar Rock anymore. Here she was simply Eleanor, a woman who worked, who endured. But shadows have long memories. One morning, while searching through the loft for spare quilts, Eleanor found a leather-bound ledger tucked deep in a chest. Its pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the name on the cover froze her breath. Vance and Kane, water rights, 1852. Her hands trembled as she read. The ledger detailed an agreement made decades earlier between her late father-in-law and Jed's kin. The Vance farm, and by extension her land, held legal rights to the valley's irrigation channels. Blackwood's schemes to seize her property suddenly made sense. It wasn't just fertile soil he craved, it was control of the water. Eleanor brought the ledger down, setting it on the table. "Did you know about this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Jed studied the book, his scarred hand brushing the pages. His silence was long and heavy. At last, he admitted, "My brother told me, years back, but I kept it buried. Blackwood's power runs deep. I feared if word spread, he'd burn this valley to ashes to claim it." Eleanor's chest ached. "So all this time, I had the proof, and I didn't know." Jed's eyes met hers, steady but dark. "Now you do. Question is, what will you do with it?" Before she could answer, a knock thundered on the cabin door. Blackwood himself stood there, flanked by two men in town council coats. Snow clung to his boots, his smile slick as oil. "Kane," he drawled, "and Widow Vance. Cozy, aren't we? I've come to offer terms. Pay the new tax or sign over the deed. Either way, your time here is done." Eleanor's pulse pounded, but Jed stepped into the doorway, rifle in hand. "Her land's not yours, Blackwood. Never was, and I'll not let you bully her." Blackwood's smirk widened. "Careful, Kane. Harboring a woman who owes debt makes you no better than a squatter. The law will find you guilty, too. Cedar Rock won't stand with a widow too fat for decency and a hermit too wild for church." The words struck like lashes. For a moment, Eleanor felt herself shrink, shame clawing at her. But then she looked at Jed, his broad frame blocking Blackwood's malice, his silence a shield, and she remembered the ledger upstairs, the proof of truth in her hands. "I won't sign anything," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "This farm is mine by right, and the water of this valley belongs to the people, not to you." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. He spat in the snow. "We'll see about that." Then he turned, his men following, leaving behind the threat of storm. That night, Eleanor sat by the fire, the ledger on her lap. Fear gnawed at her, but beside it burned something new, resolve. She was done being silent, done being mocked into shadows. Jed broke the quiet. "When the time comes, I'll stand with you." Eleanor closed the ledger, her hand steady now. "Not just stand with me, Jed. Stand beside me." The fire popped, sparks leaping upward. Outside, the wind carried Blackwood's threats down the valley, but inside, two figures sat firm, ready to face what would come. The thaw of spring had barely touched Cedar Rock when Blackwood struck. Eleanor was kneading bread at the table when the distant rumble of hooves reached her ears. She looked up sharply, flour dusting her hands. Jed had already taken his rifle from its hooks by the hearth. His face was grim, his shoulders set like stone. Outside, 5 riders stormed into the yard. At their head was Thaddeus Blackwood, his fine coat gleaming, his smile sharp as a knife. Behind him rode hired men with pistols at their belts. Blackwood called out, his voice carrying over the yard. "Eleanor Vance, by order of the council, this land is seized. You and your hermit protector are trespassers. Sign the deed, or we'll drive you out." Eleanor stepped into the doorway, shawl tight around her shoulders, the ledger clutched in her hand. Her heart pounded, but her voice rang clear. "You have no right. This book proves the water belongs to this farm and through it, the valley. You want to own Cedar Rock, but you cannot own what was promised long before you." A murmur rose from the growing crowd. Townsfolk had followed, drawn by the noise. Neighbors stood in the yard now, farmers, wives, even children, watching. Blackwood's smirk faltered. "That ledger is worthless. The law answers to me." Before he could press further, Reverend Alcott stepped forward from the crowd, his voice booming. "No, Blackwood, we all know the truth now. This woman has been mocked and cast aside, but she has stood with more dignity than you'll ever know. If you burn her down, you burn us all." The townsfolk nodded, murmurs swelling into shouts. Cody, the orphan boy, darted from the barn with a pitchfork, standing at Eleanor's side. Clara Miller, cheeks pale but eyes defiant, joined him. One by one, the people of Cedar Rock moved closer, forming a wall between Blackwood's men and the cabin. Jed raised his rifle, not at the men, but high into the air. The crack of gunpowder split the silence. "Enough," he thundered. "This ends today. You will not take her land. You will not take her dignity. If you try, you'll have to go through all of us." Blackwood's eyes darted across the faces. Eleanor with the ledger, Jed unyielding, the preacher, the townsfolk united. His sneer twisted into something uglier, fear. He yanked his reins, spitting curses. "This isn't finished." With a snap of his whip, he and his men wheeled their horses and thundered down the valley, chased by the roar of townsfolk's voices rising in victory. Eleanor's knees nearly gave, but Jed's steady arm caught her. The ledger pressed against her chest. She looked at the crowd standing firm around her and realized she was no longer alone. The yard quieted after the thunder of hooves faded, leaving only the sound of wind through the pines. Eleanor stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped close, the ledger heavy in her hands. Her chest still rose and fell with the rush of the confrontation, but her eyes no longer held fear. Jed lowered his rifle and leaned it against the wall. His broad hand rested briefly on her shoulder, steady and warm. "It's over, for now," he said. Neighbors lingered, some stepping forward to clasp Eleanor's hand, others to promise lumber and nails to rebuild the barn Blackwood's men had torched weeks before. For the first time, their gazes carried respect instead of ridicule. That night, the cabin glowed with firelight. Cody slept by the hearth, Clara hummed softly as she mended a torn dress, and Jed sat carving wood, his presence filling the room with quiet strength. Eleanor looked around at the small ragtag family that had formed around her and felt tears prick her eyes. "This is home now," she whispered, more to herself than anyone. Jed glanced up, his eyes steady on hers. "If you'll have it," he answered simply. Her heart swelled. Outside, the mountains loomed dark against the stars, their silence vast and eternal. She knew Blackwood might try again, that hardships would come, but she also knew she would never face them alone. Eleanor tightened the shawl around her shoulders, a smile trembling on her lips. For the first time since widowhood had left her adrift, she felt not cast aside, but rooted, strong, chosen, unafraid. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded why stories like Eleanor's matter. They're not only about the frontier, but about all of us, about finding dignity when the world laughs, about standing tall even when the odds press heavy. Eleanor was mocked for her size, her widowhood, her struggle, but in the end she found strength, family, and love. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Share your story in the comments. And if you still believe that courage and kindness can outlast greed and cruelty, stay with us. The next tale is already on its way.